I'm Rachel Barr from the Academy of Science and Entrepreneurship. This is our American Studies Moth project.
I'm Pam Gunkel. I'm the Social Studies half of an American Studies class, which is a co-taught class of English and U.S. history.
So what we're going to introduce to you is our Moth project, and what you're looking at here is our entry document. And basically, just to summarize what you're looking at, because it is blurry, we introduce what the moth is, and then we introduce that to have a voice in history, you need to be able to understand and read narratives. And then we invite students to also tell their personal story, which is our driving question, is where is the role of narratives, including your own, in American history?
One of the first things we did in terms of the history is we broke apart the entry document. There were 4 iconic photographs in the entry document, plus some quotes that reference this as tumultuous time. We're looking at the Civil Rights Movement between 1956 and 1965. And we discovered they did not understand the images. We started out with a gallery walk, asking them what they know about what they're seeing. We figured out very quickly they know only 2 things about the Civil Rights Movement. They know Rosa Parks and they know the I Have a Dream speech. So then we had them analyze in a gallery walk quotes from the entry document and the iconic pictures. We asked them, what do you see? And then what are your need to knows based on what you see? And they kind of talk back and forth. For example, here, somebody said that's Ruby Bridges. Somebody else said no, Ruby Bridges was a little girl. And we used this as our need to knows to move us into the Civil Rights Movement, which became a clear need to know. This is the first activity that we did, because in order to understand the background, you needed to know something about the Civil Rights Movement. So they created a civil rights timeline. Each group had an event that they had to create. For the timeline, they needed 1 to 2 iconic photos with a description. They needed quotes from their event, and then they needed to give us a brief description. And we physically created this timeline on the wall outside of our classroom. They had to present each of these, and there was a quiz that was a short answer kind of quiz that they had to do on these events of the Civil Rights Movement.
So they were responsible for sharing the information that students would have a quiz on, and so they kind of acted as each other's review as well for the information. We also created a map too, and this is something that we created in the classroom, and it was the same civil rights events. However, you can see that we've placed them according to their geographical location. What this is kind of a zoomed in version of those civil rights events, and this is actually what one of the students created, and they did such a great job presenting it, and I don't think can do it justice as the way that they presented it, but this will give you an example of what what the timeline looks like and what the map looks like if you were to zoom in on those products.
So this is their informational piece on their particular topic, which is the use of the dogs and the fire hoses in Birmingham. These are the quotes that they chose. And when these were presented, they had to explain context and why they chose these and why they mattered, which they did an excellent job of doing. And then they also included an iconic picture. And this is the iconic picture that two pictures that they chose that they spoke to when they gave their presentation. And they actually did this again with parents when we were illustrating how PBL projects work in American Studies. From this point then, they agreed that they were ready. If they were going to write narratives, they needed to know what a narrative looked like. They needed an example. And we went to the Civil Rights Movement to provide our examples. And what I did is I pulled books that I was familiar, I've read all of these, and I pulled readings from these books. They are all first person except for this one, and it involves a lot of interviews with her. It's not all first person. And these are what we used. We also this year were able to use John Lewis's March, which is a graphic novel which looks at his experiences in the Civil Rights Movement.
So what we ended up doing with the narratives, because we figured there were so many narratives that students wanted to read and find information from, that we kind of did a jigsaw thing. So each group was responsible for reading and annotating the narrative that they chose, and then they had to share information about that narrative to the rest of the class. And so these are just some of the examples of what they shared out. Time and setting, story arc, because that's something that we know that they're going to need to understand in order to write their own narratives. The perspective shared in the narrative, so who else was involved in the writing of that. Theme, and then they also had to present a picture that defined and related to that narrative. We also gave them the choice to present these in first person. That was kind of the advanced level of the rubric, was to put themselves in the place of the person who wrote it, and we did have students who chose to do that, and it was very, very powerful. It was also really great practice for when they were going to tell their own stories.
Yeah, we did not film those. I wish we had, because a couple of the students that did it, it was moving. You could tell they were moved when they put themselves into the story.
So from there, they decided that they were ready to actually start looking into the moth. I think at first they were a little bit hesitant because they knew that they were going to have to tell their own story live on stage. But once they became familiar with how a narrative is set up and how to present a narrative, then they were ready to start exploring the moth website. So what we kind of did on the very first day was just give them a chance to explore the website on their own. We had a list of student-friendly narratives that they could look into, and we created a listening guide for them, and all of this is shared in Echo. And basically what the listening guide did was walk them through the exact same things that they looked at in the civil rights narrative. So where does the moth storyteller begin their story? What is the story arc? What is the resolution? What is the theme? And how do they tell their story on stage? And so they were able to kind of explore that website with those criteria points on their own.
We do have a go-to story that we always use. There is a story of a black woman who dropped out of school. She's working as a health aide, and she goes to a home to help a gentleman and discovers that there's a giant Klan robe and Klan memorabilia in the room where she's taking care of the man. It's a really powerful story.
And another one that we use is LOL by Adam Gopnik, which tells of his relationship with his son, who absolutely refuses to answer his questions about how are you, how was school today? But then he would go into his bedroom and instant message his dad. And that's how they built their relationship. And so students seem to be able to connect to that one really well. So once students were able to explore the narratives on their own, we kind of did what we call a chalk talk, which allows students to come up here and indicate what worked really well in the stories that they heard on the moth and what they would want to replicate in their own. And so you can kind of see that there were certain things that were circled that stood out to them and us, including expand on one moment, build a connection with your audience, use descriptive words, telling the background of the story before you jump into the story arc.
Put your listener in the moment. And this was a class conversation. We didn't create this. The kids created this, and this was a class conversation.
So from there, what we did was create a list of non-negotiables, things that students thought every moth narrative needed to have. And then we also created a list of things that were nice to include that students enjoyed while they were watching some of the moth narratives, but might not be something that needed to be required on the rubric. So for example, a lot of them identified comedy as something that was very nice to include, but you didn't have to be a comedian to tell your story. And so that was not on the non-negotiables. And we ended up using some of these criteria points in the rubric for their moth narrative. And then from there, they were able to identify their next steps, which included brainstorming their own stories, revising their theme, and deciding what kind of story that they wanted to tell. So brainstorming looked different for each student. What we wanted to point out to them was that the themes that they pointed out in their their civil rights narrative presentations, that they had very, very similar themes. However, each story can be unique. And so that kind of told them that they all have a unique story, even if they are sharing the same theme.
And we're able to go back and show them they had identified these themes. We didn't identify these themes. They did when they did those presentations of the narratives. So again, it's their voice in identifying themes.
So then from there, we did multiple brainstorming activities, and these are just some examples of some things that we did. List making, kind of picking pictures and going from there to tell the story behind the picture. And then they shared those with their groups in kind of casual conversation. So these weren't formal presentations. They simply would sit with their group members and tell a story just like you would with your friends on your front porch or downstairs in the cafeteria. And so what ended up happening from there was that students were able to say, oh, your story reminded me at this other time that I did this, or I broke my arm that one time too. And so that's how they were able to build their stories, was just through casual conversation, which was our goal.
We also had a lot of students who would, we hear this every year, my story's not significant enough. I don't have a story, and we're now very confident everybody has a story. They find a story to tell, and they come to realize this as they do some of this conversation.
So these are actually pictures from, we've been doing this project, this is our third year that we did this, and these are pictures from our Moth event last year. And these are students who are telling their story live on stage at our Moth event. Parents were invited, other students in the school were invited, administrators were invited. And we had an MC from a previous year to introduce each student.
This young man right here.
It was recorded from the local radio station WFHB, and it was aired, I think 2 weeks after the event happened. It was aired on the radio. And these are pictures and tweets that we put out there after the event.
And even the ones that weren't aired are archived. There are archived stories at the radio station.
Yes. And those links are in Echo.
Yeah.
You can go to those links. It's linked to WFHB, and you can listen to every single student's narrative.
And you will see how we've tweaked it over the 3 years. We're always kind of adding and adjusting what we're doing with it. And the students told us when we Critical Friends last year, they wanted a larger event. And so we did our first evening event this year, both an in-class and an evening for those who couldn't come for the evening event. And this is student feedback. We always Critical Friends project, and this is Critical Friends feedback.
Yep, so at the end of every project, we always ask for their I likes and I wonders. And almost every year that we've done it, they've wanted it to be bigger and better than the year before. And so that's our goal, is every time we do this is to make it a bigger event. And so you can see up here that they noticed that the audience was very welcoming. They enjoyed the freedom that they had, and they thought that there was a lot of peer-to-peer support. They learned how to tell a story in addition to writing the story. So you can see that they felt the academic challenge of writing the story, but then also enjoyed the freedom of being able to tell their story live in front of friends.
I also find in terms of the social studies, they talked about how hope and courage could be shown in unique perspectives. They demonstrate that they have a sense that the civil rights movement was not just famous people. I know somebody, when we were looking at a picture of the law enforcement attacking Martin Luther King Jr., and they were kind of stunned. And I pointed, and they come to understand he wasn't famous at that time period. This is the way people were treated. So I feel like it does a really effective job of illustrating the movement part of the civil rights movement, the story, because history is a story of all those people who chose to step up. Also, we do preview this project with the movie Long Walk with Whoopi Goldberg that looks at the bus boycott. And that's our project.
Yeah.
And the reason that we have this PowerPoint, we didn't create it just for this. We have used this multiple times talking to parents as we recruit when we're explaining how does a co-taught project-based learning classroom work, and what does a project look like, and that's why we've used this and have this. Thank you.
Thanks.